What has happened, everybody? This is Wrong Reel, the podcast for hardcore cinephiles, where, Adam, what do we cover here on this podcast?
We cover everything from Jean-Luc Godard to Jean-Luc Picard.
Now, what were some of the contenders that you also came up with that were some of the also-rans? Because I remember there was like a long feed in this like hidden like Twitter chat room where everybody was throwing out these like little catchphrases, but that was the one that stuck out to me. But can you remember any of the other ones that you came up with?
No, there were a lot, but they were just kind of like a lot of people were coming up with some rather good ones. But yeah, that one sort of, we were all trying to come up with this dichotomy between something old and something new to show the sort of breadth of information that the podcast covered. And somehow that one sort of covered the biggest between, classic French cinema to, science fiction, pop culture. That's pretty much the
it's like the fact that it kind of rhymes, but they're also two French names,
right?
And it covers, French New Wave up through like Star Trek on television. It's just like, it seems like it covers like this enormous spectrum in two totally different extremes. And so as soon as I saw that one, I was like, that is the cleverest thing anyone has ever written. So I'm going to use it from now on.
Their names are virtually identical. Like I remember watching Star Trek: The Next Generation and thinking, "Wow, Jean-Luc Picard is so close to Jean-Luc Godard." It's just like the most. I mean, I always wondered if that was a little bit of a nod to him, or if it was just a decision made by Gene Roddenberry to name his character that. I don't know.
I have no idea. Yeah, because I was definitely familiar with Picard long before I was familiar with Godard. I think Star Trek came out when I was like in 5th grade, or Next Generation came out when I was like in 5th grade, and I probably never even heard Godard's name till I was probably 19 or 20 when I first saw Breathless.
Right. So that's, it's very likely that, in my opinion, it's very likely that there must have been some awareness on the part of the Star Trek TNG creators about the similar sounding names, but it just seems too much of a coincidence.
To overlook entirely. Well, when you're not coming up with catchphrases for podcasts, tell people out there a little bit about yourself.
I'm a jack of all trades, if you will. I'm film producer, illustrator. I enjoy doing all types of
thumbnail designer,
graphic work for the Wrong Reel podcast. There's several recent thumbnail graphics that I've created for the Wrong Reel or the Geekin' Out YouTube channel. I enjoy doing creative things of all types and collaborating with people that I feel I can learn from and gain new experiences from. So it's the Wrong Reel crew is a great group of people to be working with, talking with, learning from. It's a really great group. So I encourage people to go back and listen to all of the 372 episodes of Wrong Reel.
Absolutely. I know Becky's listened to all of them, and I think Chuck Our Mystery has listened to all of them. But beyond that, I'm not aware of anybody else who likes us. I mean, Becky's just a very, very loyal friend, and Chuck, he initially came to us just as a listener, but I'm pretty sure I haven't even listened to all of them. So they definitely had me beat on that front. But we've definitely been assembling a fun crew of friends and collaborators over the last couple of years.
Without a doubt. And all of them just bring something unique to the table, which is what I love about it. Everybody has a unique voice. Some people are just brilliant at film criticism. Some are filmmakers. Some are artists. It's just a great crew, and everybody just has their own unique voice that they bring. Not everyone always agrees on everything, which is part of the
Last Jedi.
Yeah, exactly. But there's also a great history of that in film criticism. I just recently watched the Roger Ebert documentary Life Itself, and the whole section on the sort of difficult relationship between Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel was just fascinating. They showed so many great outtakes of them in between shooting.
No, I remember that clip. And they're trying to get a commercial right. and they
Yeah.
keep talking shit in between the takes about who's making mistakes and that sort of thing. And
Right.
yeah,
Oh,
it was a love-hate relationship that could oftentimes be very adversarial.
yeah. But at the same time, I think it did bring out the best in both of their critiques. It helped them write better. It helped them really think about their films better. And on rare occasion, they both had, you know, switched their tune on certain films over the years after sort of reevaluating it, which is something that many critics would never do in the past. But they were some of the first to sort of say, you know, I was wrong about that, and I really do think it's a better film now after 10 years than I thought it was when I first saw it. So I always try to look at films that way too. I don't try to just stick with my initial impression. Either whether I like it or hate it, I will sometimes revisit certain films and find something new to appreciate, or just say this doesn't hold up at all. You know, I loved it when it came out.
Yeah, that's
but
always
not
the
any-
risk of when you're revisiting movies, and especially movies we're going to be talking about today, because these are movies from our childhood, and you
Yeah.
always run the risk of destroying the illusion or the fantasy that might have held you so spellbound as a child. And
Right.
there's always the risk that you might just absolutely evaporate those memories. But sometimes it can be very surprising and very illuminating when you go back and, wow, not only is this a great kids movie, but it just really works as a film, and it really has some enduring power. And I think some of the movies we're going to talk about today definitely can lay claim to that effect. But we're going to be talking today about two animators, Jules Bass and Arthur Rankin Jr., and they've been talked about quite a bit lately because stop motion right now, at least, is a little bit in vogue due to Wes Anderson and Isle of Dogs. And he has spoken very openly about the fact that the Rankin Bass holiday specials that were stop motion specials back in the 60s and 70s had a huge impact on him when he was a kid. I mean, I'm just old enough to remember when one of these was coming on around Christmas time, you'd almost kind of mark your calendar because there was no VHS market or anything like that. Like if you missed it when it came on TV, you had to wait another year, or you weren't going to get to see it. You weren't going to get to see it. And so these guys kind of owned children's entertainment in a lot of ways, especially around the holiday time, through the 60s and 70s. But the period we're going to be talking about today is when around 1975, 76, they started dabbling in the world of medieval fantasy and kind of the Tolkien-esque and outright Tolkien adaptations. And those four films are The Hobbit, Return of the King, Last Unicorn, and Flight of the Dragons. And what's interesting for me is that it coincides perfectly, it dovetails nicely with the arrival of D&D as a major cultural phenomenon that really had its hooks into me at precisely the same time. And I think for me as a young kid, it's impossible for me to separate my love of this type of animation from the vibes I feel from D&D. And in a lot of ways, these movies and the music and the look and the flavor of them kind of informed the way my imagination would envision things that were happening when I was playing Dungeons and Dragons as a kid. So yeah, we're going on a very powerful, sentimental journey for me today.
That's great. Yeah, it's. I think I asked you before we even started planning this episode why you thought there was so much of this sort of fantasy animation, in particular in the late 70s and early 80s, because not just in animation, but in cinema in general, there was a huge surge.
Sword and sorcery, yeah.
Sword and sorcery, and many of them very low budget. Some of them filmed in Italy and dubbed over in English, like just really, some of them very bad, but it was very much a popular trend sort of in the post-Star Wars time frame. And I always sort of thought, well, Star Wars is more fantasy than science fiction, even though it's set in space. I always kind of thought that these were cheaper ways to basically tell similar type hero's journey tales with swords and battles without having the need to have big budgets with visual effects and spaceships. So
tales of high adventure.
Exactly. So yeah, it was a really exciting time, I think, for animation, because we were starting to get such a diversity in the type of non-Disney animation. I mean, dating certainly, as we've said in previous episodes, going back to the early Ralph Bakshi, we were getting more adult animation. But then he even started entering the fantasy sword and sorcery, animated realm with Wizards, and then later on with
Fire
films
and
like
yeah.
Fire and Ice, and of course his Lord of the Rings. So it really was a popular sort of genre, if you will, for maybe an 8 8-year window.
Yeah, it was for a hot minute, suddenly, like, my favorite genre was getting a lot of love and attention. And yeah, it's funny. And it's never really been that way since. I mean, even during the time of Lord of the Rings, not like the Lord of the Rings movies in 2001, 2, and 3 launched this, like, resurgence of, like, the fantasy genre. It was kind of a one-off. The trilogy came, and it inspired, obviously, the Hobbit trilogy, like, a decade later. But it's not like it spawned a lot of imitators. In the late 70s and early 80s, there were so many cheap, inexpensive sword and sorcery movies coming out. I mean, like, whether it was like Beastmaster or The Sword and the Sorcerer or Conan the Barbarian or Yor or whatever you want to say. I mean, we were getting inundated with them. And it definitely had a massive impact on me as a kid. I just ate it all up.
And even Disney got in with films like Sword in the Stone and The Black Cauldron. Like, they were totally saying, wait a minute, maybe our talking animals aren't what people want anymore. And they tried to sort of take a chance in branching out as well. And of course, those films didn't do great for them. So they ended up sort of returning to their roots eventually with like The Little Mermaid and everything. But it's a fascinating period. And just like you, I kind of grew up on these films, watching them as a child. So they on television for the most part, as most of us did. I think it's interesting a lot of times how people kind of looking back poo-poo watching movies on television with commercials or on VHS and the low resolution. But we all, and many filmmakers, grew up watching movies that way over and over and over again. It didn't hinder our imagination or our ability to appreciate them. Certainly, it's a much better time now. And people that are younger today don't realize how lucky they are to be able to see things at home in HD or even 4K. It's incredible. But at the time when you're a kid, that's all we knew.
Yeah. So, we weren't complaining about the resolution.
No. So it really, I actually, in fact, used to record a lot of these movies off television with the commercials, and sometimes rewatching them over and over again, the commercials became part of the experience.
Nice.
I remembered the commercial that would come right after a particular break, and watching them again now, I'm like, wait a minute, there was supposed to be a commercial for Toys R Us right there or something, and it's just it's interesting how those commercials really became embedded in the experience as a child.
Also, I'm not aware of any earlier examples of this, but what's cool is that this is one of the first big examples I can think of where you have American studios outsourcing the animation to Japanese animation companies. Like even though I wasn't aware of it as a little kid, you can totally see the Japanese influence all over these later. I mean, as an adult,
yeah.
Like, oh my God, like it's just certain stylistic tropes that you recognize from a bunch of other Japanese animated movies. And so I can't think of an earlier example. I mean, perhaps Voltron, but it's just, I was exposed to some of these at such a young age. It's hard to know the chronology in terms of when I first got exposed. But definitely, this was some of my earliest exposure to Japanese animation, at least coming from a Japanese studio, even if the source material was being originated elsewhere.
Right, and even their stop motion animations, which they use a technique called Animotion, I believe, that was all done, and that was all outsourced to Japan as well back in the 60s and 70s. So these guys were more than anything producers of animation, producers and directors, but they weren't really the hands-on kind of animator guys, which I think other directors like Don Bluth was a Disney animator. He actually did the down and dirty work when he was, working at Disney. Ralph Bakshi was an animator. He did later on obviously hire people to do the work for him, but I don't know how much of the actual animation Rankin and Bass were doing. If it was all being outsourced in Japan, it seems like they were more sort of directing from afar and guiding the projects in the direction they wanted them to go.
Well, before we get into these 4 movies that we have on deck today, do you want to give any special love or attention to any of their animated TV specials, particularly their stop? Because they did do traditional animation, but it seems like it's the stop motion ones like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer that really are near and dear to a lot of people's hearts.
Yeah, I mean, I think like most kids, that was probably the one that I most watched as a kid during Christmas time. And as you mentioned, before we had a VCR, if you missed that airing on TV in December, you missed it, and you looked forward to it. You looked in your TV guide, when's it going to be on? And I remember in particular, one year we missed it, and I was so mad. And again, kids today just don't know that we really had no other alternative. Like there was no place to rent it or watch it online. Like you literally had to wait another year if you wanted to see that special. And it was sort of, it made it all the sweeter in a way because you had a year of buildup of anticipation to see this
Kevin
show.
Smith speaks the same way about all the Charlie Brown animated movies, how he would mark his calendar like 2 months out. And it was so important to him because if you missed them, boom, it was like Halley's Comet. You had to wait like 85 years before it came back around again.
Yeah, I bought this past year a Blu-ray box set where they remastered like 3 of the stop motion holiday classics in HD, and they look beautiful. I tried showing them to my 4-year-old daughter, and like she kind of liked it, but she didn't quite understand what it was, like the animation style, because it's
gotta
just not
feel
common.
like cardboard compared to like cotton candy for a child today. If they're used to watching the latest Pixar extravaganza, which is just like total complete sensory overload, and then you watch these kind of inexpensive, very calm, like almost kind of uneventful stop motion movies.
Yeah.
It's got to be so like such an out of body experience being exposed to this kind of stuff.
I know. I mean, I even showed her last night Bill Plimpton's new couch gag for The Simpsons, which aired on Sunday, which is a spoof of his 1987 film Your Face with Homer singing, and she kind of was like smiling, but I don't think she had any clue what was going on. like his head's like blowing up and then going through the ears, and I think again, this is a generation that's growing up on Frozen and Zootopia, and this is just totally just different to them. Like the animation for them is so pristine, so perfect, and so bright and vivid. It's just compared to like Rankin and Bass, whether it's stop motion or their cell animation, it's crude by comparison, and which I actually really like.
Well, I hope that so like a movie like Isle of Dogs, which I saw Thursday last week. I hope a movie like that will help people remember the joy of stop motion animation. Because obviously, if you watch movies about Jan Svankmajer, you're going to be absolutely thunderstruck. And I feel like every once in a while, Leica will whip out something really cool as well. But it's such a fascinating medium, and I think Isle of Dogs is one of the strongest films of Wes Anderson's career. So my hope is that his unbridled imagination, obviously like his massive cult following among cinephiles, will help keep this form of storytelling alive, because I feel like film will be a poorer place in the absence of stop motion animation.
Yep. And it's interesting because there is now, and I haven't seen Isle of Dogs yet. It's true stop motion, correct?
It is true
it's
stop
actual,
motion, absolutely.
Shot with frame by frame with a camera, because there is a style now of computer animation which tries to imitate, mimic that stop motion feel, and sometimes it can look kind of cool, but it's just off. It's not quite right. It's again trying to mimic the kind of jitteriness that comes with stop motion.
It needs to feel like it's there. Like when I was in high school, Nightmare Before Christmas came out, and I went and saw that, I think as a junior in high school, and my eyes went wide and my jaw dropped, and I was just swept away for 2 hours, and I listened to the soundtrack 100 million times. But there's something about the fact that like when you watch stop motion, there's something tangible about it. Just gives it a different flavor. It's like watching the early South Parks when they were still using the construction paper. The fact that you can actually like, see the textures there, it just gives you a different experience from the the CG versions of South Park you see in later seasons. So once again, I don't want animation to be exclusively stop motion, but I love it when a great filmmaker comes along and really shows the full force of what it's capable of.
Yeah, exactly. And it's great that somebody with such a, as you said, such a cult following as Wes Anderson is taking a chance and getting the backing to do something like this. I mean, it certainly is not going to be the type of box office hit that that Frozen or Moana is, but it hopefully will do well enough. And we've talked about this before. If these types of films do well enough, more people will do them and make them. But if they don't, if they bomb, then it just tells those financial backers, no one wants to see this, and we're not going to give people money to do it anymore.
Yeah, the last Leica movie, Kubo and the Two Strings, I think it was called.
Yeah.
I saw it, loved it, had a great time. I mean, full disclosure, I thought the last act, it kind of fell to pieces, and it was a little disappointing. But the movie had, Matthew McConaughey and like all these major stars and that sort of thing, and it totally, completely bombed. I thought it was the best Leica movie yet, but it was the lowest performer of any Leica movie. And so, every once in a while, like when something like that happens, it definitely puts the whole format at risk.
Exactly. And despite having, as you said, name, voiceover actors, as big stars providing the voices, as well as critical acclaim, sometimes these things just don't translate to box office dollars. And animation continues to be a tricky genre. And even going back to these films, I mean, Rankin Bass had huge success with all of these holiday specials. I mean, they were the go-to guys in the 60s and 70s. And then they started to go to cel animation more and more and away from that stop motion animation. And their Hobbit film, of course, was a very popular film, a television movie. But into the 80s, the films, we'll talk about them, one in particular never even got released theatrically because I don't know if it was just the timing or the genre was starting to sort of fade a little bit. But again, these are not films that were huge blockbuster hits in any respect.
Yeah, the studio was defunct by 1987. So we were kind of looking at like the final chapter of what they were all about.
Yeah, this was part of the beginning of their downfall, if you will, which, again, not to say that they didn't have a huge, an incredible legacy of work, and not everything can live forever. They were getting older, but without a doubt, these films have huge cult followings, but they were never mainstream films that everyone that loves animation was seeing. They weren't the Disney films that people see over and over and over again.
Although I think The Hobbit is one of those movies that I might have seen. I mean, there are a lot of movies that I saw on repeat as a kid. The Hobbit is in the mix as one of the ones where from like age 6 to like 18, I watched an almost humiliating number of times where I knew this movie cold, and I still revisit it every once in a while. And I've been overjoyed to see that with other kids that I've shown it to when they were like 5 or 6, like with like my little siblings. Something about the style and the music, they come together so well. I think it's in a lot of ways like the perfect adaptation. Granted, it loses a lot of stuff from the novel because there's just not enough time to work with all the material from the novel. But I think this cartoon from 1977 is heads and shoulders superior to what Peter Jackson achieved with his 3 giant live action, mega productions. But an interesting side note, which I just learned like a day or so ago, The Hobbit was animated by Topcraft, which is a Japanese animation studio which is now gone, but the team would reform as part of Studio Ghibli under Hayao Miyazaki. So a lot of these people who made The Hobbit lent their hands to a lot of classic Japanese cinema to come.
And interestingly, the style is very, very different. So even though you had some of the same animators and animation supervisors, they did create a very distinct look and feel for The Hobbit, which is very different than what later Miyazaki would sort of create with his earlier films. In particular, I think they first worked on Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind. That was one of the first movies that, after Flight of Dragons, they moved over and started developing Nausicaa. So yeah, the animation, as I said before, is a little crude at times. It's not as polished and as layered as a lot of the bigger studios, but part of that look, I think, is part of the charm, for me at least.
I mean, to this day, if I read a paragraph from Lord of the Rings, if there's a scene involving Gandalf, I picture him as drawn in this movie, and the voice that I hear is not Ian McKellen's. I hear John Huston, because I think if there's a person put on this planet to be the voice of Gandalf, it is John Huston. Granted, really good filmmaker, but long before I was aware of The Treasure of the Sierra Madre or Maltese Falcon or The Man Who Would Be King, his voice was so familiar to me. And I remember when I first saw Chinatown in college, and I was like, what the fuck? Why is this voice so familiar? Because he was playing the villain in it. And finally I was like, oh my God, that's the guy. And I had back then I didn't even have the internet. I had like a reference book, and I looked up John Huston and saw that he was in fact, both the villain of Chinatown as well as my favorite wizard from The Hobbit. But goddamn, there's a scene early on in The Hobbit where they're having dinner and they're having drinks and the dwarves are singing, and John Huston starts to read some of Tolkien's poetry. And it's some of the poetry taken straight from the novel about the history of the dwarves and the way they were weaving spells into their crafts and things like that. And it is as magical as anything as I've ever been exposed to. It moves your soul in ways, especially if you're a fan of fantasy and dwarves and dragons and that sort of thing. It's as good as medieval fantasy gets, hearing John Huston read poetry to these astonishing images.
I agree. It really is a beautiful little film, because it does, as you said, encompass so much story in, like, I don't think it's even an hour and a half long. It might be like 83 minutes or something. It's relatively short. It's a relatively quick film, but it somehow tells that story very succinctly, and it never sort of feels like it's dragging, and it doesn't really feel, even if you've read the novel, it doesn't really feel as though anything's major, like anything is missing that needed to be in it. There are certainly a lot of great little moments in the novel that are great in the novel, but they sort of did a good job, I think, at editing out anything that just didn't absolutely have to be in there, and to keep the story moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really helps is the voice talents they assemble for this are just mind-boggling. Now, obviously, I already mentioned John Huston, but having like Otto Preminger play the King of the Wood Elves, I mean, Otto Preminger is one of the greatest filmmakers who's ever lived. Like, I don't know what was going on. They're like, let's find the finest filmmakers of all time and get him to play these characters. But he's incredible. And then, of course, you've got, as fucking Smaug, you got Richard Boone, who played the bad guy in a million classic westerns. And they're also just like Orson Bean as Bilbo and Hans Conried as Thorin Oakenshield. Just the voice acting, and a person who is only listed in IMDb as Brother Theodore. Brother Theodore is Gollum. I think he gives Andy Serkis a run for his money. He's an incredible Gollum.
Oh yeah.
So just across the board, the voice acting is just so fantastic. But I think in the end, what really makes this movie come together is that pretty much each and every single song in this is distinctive and it's original and feels totally different from the other songs in the movie, and they all work. They all have this great sense of like being is this part of like an epic ballad? And the fact that they use Tolkien's poetry from the novel as a jumping off point for the lyrics for these kind of like borderline hippie kind of folksy tunes.
Yeah.
I mean, to this day, whenever I think of like medieval adventure stories, that kind of medieval, folksy, kind of hippie music is the first kind of music that comes to mind.
I agree completely. There's something about the sort of 60s and 70s fantasy married to whatever was happening in our culture at the time with the music and the drug culture, all of it. Somehow it all kind of belongs together. And, look at some of the even rock music of the time, Led Zeppelin. They were singing about all types of sort of crazy fantasy concepts in the lyrics of their work. So there was definitely this fascination. Or the album art. My God, the album art to some of the top artists and bands in the 60s and 70s was so not just psychedelic, but had such fantastical images of dragons and crazy shit. Like there was a definite sort of, and one thing that people don't probably all realize is that these books were written, The Hobbit was written in the late 30s, but The Lord of the Rings was in the mid 50s. So they were kind of just starting to really catch on.
It took a long time for them to really become smash successes.
Right, exactly. But it's not even that far if you think about it. I mean, Harry Potter doesn't feel like it was written that long ago, but it was the late 90s, and that's equivalent to when The Hobbit was made and when the Lord of the Rings the Lord of the Rings books were first released. But they did captivate a generation of readers in the 60s, and I think there was, by the time The Hobbit came around, people were clamoring for a visual representation and an adaptation of these stories because they had just become such a part of.
So much so that you have like rival producers competing for the rights. Like you get into a very tricky thing where from The Hobbit through Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, followed by the Rankin and Bass Return of the King, you get this weird kind of broken, disjointed telling of the story that doesn't quite flow together. But if you know the novels, you can watch The Hobbit, followed by Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, which basically takes you up to halfway through to the Two Towers, like the end of the Battle of Helm's Deep.
Yeah.
And then you kind of jump ahead And then you have this Rankin Bass Return of the King, which is a very truncated, kind of abbreviated version of the novel. But if you know the source material, at least you're getting little scenes and little fragments that you can. But it's funny, but as a kid, it took me a long time to actually man up and read the goddamn books. I would kind of fake it and bluff my way through with my knowledge of the cartoons. I remember in 5th grade, I gave a book report on The Hobbit. And of course, I didn't read a word of it. But I remember what I did. I drew. My big thing back then was I would do a big drawing on a poster board as like a visual aid. And I basically got up there and I kind of bluffed my way through retelling the movie as much as I could remember from the cartoon, even like imitating Gollum and stuff like that. And I think I ended up getting like a B. But it wasn't until several years later that I actually sat down and read The Hobbit. But I had another weird thing happen to me with the Hobbit cartoon where in college, a bunch of us had the idea. There's a brief period where, for whatever reason, hallucinogenic drugs like shrooms were very, very popular, and people wanted to figure out like what movies are fun to watch on shrooms, because most movies you can't watch them on shrooms because your attention span is so short. They kind of creep you out, and you just want to leave and like leave the room. It's like a huge buzzkill. But I convinced some people that we were going to go up to the mountains in Virginia, explore nature for a while, and then we were going to rent a hotel. And I brought a VCR, and we actually plugged in my VCR in the hotel TV, and I sat them down and made them watch The Hobbit. And they squirmed and they writhed and they were not into it at all. They were just like, this is so weird and creepy. And it was just completely freaking them out. And so it was like a present for them when it was over. We threw in Blazing Saddles, which at that point we were kind of coming down and they were very much in the mood to laugh and enjoy Blazing Saddles. But it was such a weird idea to like drive out into the middle of nowhere in Virginia from Charlottesville and rent a hotel room just so we could watch The Hobbit on shrooms. Because what we didn't want was a bunch of people like interrupting us who were not on shrooms. But yeah, it was such a strange night, but they did not like it at all. I was like, I swear it's good. I swear it's good.
Well, you'll always have that experience.
Exactly, without a doubt. Or what are the scenes and or songs or moments from The Hobbit that you think are handled particularly well in this adaptation?
Well, I mean, I always felt that the ending did a great job. I mean, the novel and the movie, it's all about the build. It's a quest. Actually, all 4 of these Rankin Bass films that we're talking about are essentially quests. They're journeys to reach some distant, end and to do something, to discover something or to vanquish something. And in this case, this movie is all a build up to that confrontation with Smaug. And I actually confirmed. I found my copy of Lord of the Rings in the back in the appendices.
Yeah, it's not Smaug, it's Smaug. But I always feel self-conscious when I say Smaug. But I always pronounce it because in the cartoon it's like, I am Smaug. And so,
they do say Smaug as like in the smog in the air.
Yeah.
In the film, but he does state that in those appendices it said that the combination of AU was supposed to be pronounced "ow" as it is in German. That was his intention. So "au" as in Smaug.
And J.R.R. Tolkien took pronunciation of his words very seriously. I mean, he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford.
Exactly.
He knew what the hell he was doing. He was inventing these languages, and he had very specific pronunciations in mind. And Christopher Lee, I remember on the behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings, was bemoaning the fact that so many of the actors were just murdering the language and pronunciation. Yeah. Christopher Lee, his entire life, he would read the Lord of the Rings every year. He took it very seriously, and like he was pronouncing names like Gandalf, and like he really Saruman. Yeah. It's not Saruman, it's Saruman. Like he really took it seriously. And when he heard all these kids, especially like Elijah Wood, saying Gandalf, it's not Gandalf. Like it made his fucking his head hurt to even hear. But most of the actors in Lord of the Rings just murder the pronunciation of these names.
Yeah, I mean, and Christopher Lee. Speaking of Christopher Lee, he actually comes over to work in a Rankin Bass film with
Last Unicorn. Yeah, he plays the king in Last Unicorn.
Yeah, and according to what my research. There's a funny little story. Where is it here? He supplied the voice of King Haggard, and he showed up to the recording sessions armed with his own copy of the book because he wanted to make sure in several occasions that the things that should be in the film were not omitted. Like he's very serious about his adapting of written literature onto the screen, and he would read lines from the book which weren't in the script because he's like, no, you have to have this. And so I think I admire Christopher Lee for that. I think
Hell yeah.
that
No,
shows
he's one of the all-time
they
great icons of pop culture.
yeah.
He's a true legend, and I mean, this is a guy who's like a war hero and an assassin. He used to like take people out with like a knife to the back and things like that, and segued from being an assassin in World War II to being one of the world's most beloved pop culture icons as Dracula. Then, of course, later on, he got rediscovered with like Lord of the Rings and the Star Wars movies and things like that. But I love the fact that he was able to basically stay steadily employed throughout his entire life and beloved by fans. And I've got nothing but the utmost respect for Christopher Lee.
And I think it's kind of cool that people like directors like George Lucas and others who admired him were able to pull him out of sort of obscurity at that point and say, will you be in my movie? I loved you growing up. You know, I mean, that's probably the greatest reward for a filmmaker, to be able to employ
cast their heroes. I think the first thing I saw him was Gremlins 2, and he was creepy as hell in Gremlins 2, a new batch. But even in the 80s, he was still playing these great villains.
That was probably, I'm sure, Joe Dante, you know, saying, oh, I loved you in those horror, you know, just this is my chance to have my hero come join my film. But yeah, I mean, I think, as you asked me before, for me, the best part of The Hobbit is the sort of confrontation with Smaug. You know, that's
not even the climax. The climax is the Battle of Five Armies, which is pretty exhilarating. But it's like you had the great showdown with Smaug, and of course Bard takes him out. But then it's like they hide out and enjoy the gold for a long ass time, and finally Bard as a king comes, and you have this lead up to the Battle of Five Armies. So it's like climax after climax, and it's just so goddamn exhilarating. But for me, if I had to pick, what my favorite part of the movie is when the goblins find them in the night, and you get my favorite song of the movie, like "You Go My Lad, You Go My Lad," and they get taken down to Goblin Town. But what's cool is that they think they've been left behind by Gandalf, and they've been totally betrayed. But then when this Goblin King is about to like rip into them for having the blade Orcrist, the Goblin Cleaver, suddenly you see Glamdring just floating in the air, takes the king out, and then you see Gandalf kind of materialize with his hand beside it, and the music kicks in, and they go running off. And it just, at age 41, I still feel like I can like squat like 1,000 pounds, and I'm like, yes, this fucking rules. It's so much goddamn fun.
Yeah, I had a great time. It's been a long time since I watched The Hobbit, but I was able to get it from iTunes actually in HD, and so it was the first time I'd ever seen it. It's not available on Blu-ray, but iTunes
don't watch it on
somehow
Amazon. On Amazon, they've cropped it and made it 1.85 to 1, which basically means they're chopping the top and bottom off the screen. And I wrote an Amazon review. This is a TV movie from 1977. It's meant to be 4:3, but it drives me fucking crazy. Or even worse, I found some copies of the movie where they stretched it to be 1.85 to 1. I'm like, fuck all you guys. Like, it's just a weird thing where I just watch the movies the way they were made, and it's not that complicated.
It's I've said this before. I even mentioned it in our last episode with Bill Plimpton, because he sometimes dabbles in the 4:3 aspect ratio instead of 16:9.
And sometimes it's by chance or by accident or just overlooking.
You never know why.
He's like, we screwed up. I'm like, how do you like overlook while you're making it? It's not like you just like spit them out. Like, they take a long time to make. Like, doesn't somebody notice what aspect ratio they're making the movie in? But anyway, that's Bill.
Well, I thought originally I thought that, at least with Cop Dog, that it was because the earlier dog films were done in 4:3 before 16:9 had sort of become the new standard. So I thought maybe he was just kind of trying to create some kind of consistency with the series. But sometimes, Bill makes his own decisions or doesn't.
Absent-minded professor.
But what I brought up in that episode was that, at this period in time, obviously, this is long before HD televisions or widescreen televisions. So you basically had TV sets that were 4:3, and then you had movie theaters, which tended to project things either at a 1.85 to 1 ratio or CinemaScope, which is 2.35. And rarely ever would you see animation done at a 2.35. There were a few, like Lady and the Tramp is 2.35.
I think Sleeping Beauty is as well. Sleeping Beauty, I think, is super widescreen.
Yeah, there's a couple that did use that CinemaScope, but rarely would a non-Disney film take that chance, because they knew that ultimately the biggest audience would likely be watching these films on television. So they would do what was called animate for an open matte, which essentially is animating 4:3, and filling the entire 4:3 frame with color and imagery, but keeping all of the characters' heads and and information that's important within a 16 by widescreen frame
Gotcha.
within that. So you could just put basically the projector would mat the top and bottom for theatrical, and you wouldn't really lose anything important, but you could then open the mat up for TV and it would still fill your frame. So anytime where in current day they decide to mat these films, it really, if they weren't intended for that, in this case, this was a TV movie,
Yep.
It really are cropping off the tops of foreheads or you can't see what the character is holding at the bottom of the frame. And it looks like everything's claustrophobic because there's too much information in the frame. It needs to be opened up. And thankfully, the iTunes version that I watched was in the original 4:3 ratio in HD. And people, again, HD doesn't mean that it's widescreen. It's the resolution of the image. So it's just a common problem. There's a big actual issue right now with even HBO taking direct films and cropping like CinemaScope movies so they're 16 by 9.
That drives me fucking crazy, and you see it happening all the goddamn time.
And even the directors, unless they have a clause in their contract that says that they have the right to prevent that type of editing to take place, they have no control over it. And some of the directors are furious that their movies are being basically changed without their will, that their compositions are being chopped up.
It happens on Amazon a ton as well. Like you'll watch I think it was Last Picture Show, which is a 2.35-to-1 movie. I think that maybe it was anyway. I've left a lot of reviews where I said like, this is in the wrong aspect ratio, don't watch it. But by that point, people have already clicked the button to rent and or buy. But yeah, I love 2.35-to-1. It's when it's done well, like something like Lawrence of Arabia, it just gives you this experience that you just never get otherwise. And to crop that, I just feel like is a hate crime against great art.
And the reason why it's unnecessary for Amazon or anyone else to do that with, say, The Hobbit is because if you really don't like having those pillar boxed bars on either side, which is what they call it, pillar boxing, as opposed to letterboxing, all you have to do on your TV is hit the zoom button, and it will fill the screen without distorting it, and will crop the top and bottom.
Absolutely.
So, but you can't undo that zoom if you don't want to watch it that way. So to me, it's a travesty that maybe most people don't notice or care about, but it's mostly because they're not educated on the technical side.
It's one of the things where my entire life I've been dealing, or as a fan, because even when I was young, somehow by some miracle, I saw a thing on TV once where they're showing scenes from Jaws, and they're showing what they look like Pan and Scan, and they're showing what they look like Letterbox, and then they showed a scene from Ghostbusters. They showed the scene at the end of Ghostbusters when they're all walking up towards Zool, and they said, this is what it looks like Pan and Scan, and you couldn't see all four of them. But when it was Letterbox, you could. I was like, whoa. And it just had this enormous impact on me. I can't remember how old it was, but I was definitely a young teen or mid-teens. And here I am, 25 years later, and still fighting this battle where it's just like there's just ignorance and stupidity and bad taste seem to prevail over good sense way too much of the time.
Yeah, there's just this constant need or sort of desire by the network owners and the TV manufacturers that seem to think that the image has to fill the screen, like no matter whether it's an old 4:3 TV or a 16:9 TV, that viewers will be unable to cope with the fact that there's a little bit of black on the top and the bottom or the red and the light. It's like, no, people are smart. They'll get it. And in fact, in many cases, at least with VHS, they would sometimes put a little title card up saying this movie is presented in its original aspect ratio. The black bars on top and bottom of the screen are normal. And that's all you have to do. Most people will be like, oh, okay, no problem. Thanks for telling me.
Exactly.
And let's go watch the movie. So I know it's a tangent. It's just a little pet peeve I think that both of us share.
100%.
But it's So back to The Hobbit.
Well, yeah, it's just it's a special movie. I think it's one of the few adaptations of a novel out there that I feel like in a lot of ways it's kind of a perfect adaptation. I love and adore it, and I will continue to revisit it my entire life. Little things, just like even like when Bilbo and Gollum are having their riddle contest in the dark, and now you hear this song in the background, and the song is singing the words of some of the riddles that the two characters say to each other in the novel. So rather than do every single riddle that the novel contains, they found a way just to change it up. You hear them say a few of the riddles, and then you hear the soundtrack sing a few of the riddles. it's so atmospheric and so beautiful, and yeah, I just think they 100% knocked it out of the park, which makes it all the more a shame that the subsequent animated adaptations got so complicated and were so kind of poorly received. It's such like a disjointed, kind of broken thing, because we have here in the following year, Sal Zentz, he and Ralph Bakshi got together to do Lord of the Rings, and the plan was to do a Lord of the Rings and a Lord of the Rings 2, which would cover all three books. But for a variety of reasons that we won't go into here, because this is a Rankin Bass episode, they only did the Lord of the Rings, which covers, like I said, up through the middle part of the Two Towers. But Rankin Bass, they were like, well, they never got around to doing Return of the King, and that's still out there. Let's do Return of the King. And it's a weird thing where I saw the Return of the King cartoon many times before I ever read the novel. And I was always kind of confused by it, but it had enough good scenes in it. Like, I remember the first time I saw it, I found it on TV like halfway through, and I was like, well, I was like, this feels familiar, and it looks familiar. Like that's Gandalf. I know him from The Hobbit, and that's Gollum. I know him from The Hobbit. But like, it's like, what is this? And and it actually took me a while to figure out what story I was even watching. I just didn't know Tolkien's work well enough at the point to figure it out. But I still maintain that the Return of the King has a scene in there that Peter Jackson just failed to include entirely in his theatrical cut of Return of the King, where the Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar, when they break down the gates of Minas Tirith, you actually see him have his confrontation with Gandalf, who's waiting for him, and we actually get to have their dialogue, and it's during that dialogue that the cock crows, and that's when you know that Theoden and the Riders of Rohan have arrived. And it's so beautiful and so incredible and so exhilarating, and they handled it absolutely perfectly. But here we are in 2003, Return of the King, which is a movie I saw 6 times in the theater. I absolutely love Return of the King. But it's like, how do you not have the money shot of the Witch King of Angmar facing off against fucking Gandalf, which is like one of the coolest moments of the fucking book.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Watching this again, this is probably the one film that I haven't seen since the late 80s. You know, and I saw it on television, but I also, just like I did with The Hobbit, when we finally got a VCR, rented it on VHS multiple times, and didn't quite fully understand it until I read the books. And that's the one problem with this trilogy of films, if you include the Bakshi film, is they don't, like you said, they don't quite work unless as a trilogy or even as individual films, unless The Hobbit works as a standalone.
The Hobbit works just fine, yeah.
But these two, they really don't tell a complete story, and they don't quite explain everything unless you've read the books. If you've read the books, you kind of know the motivations, why they're doing what they're doing. They do through song, again, tell, and through narration. It's interesting because this film in particular jumps back and forth through time a lot to sort of tell the story, which is sort of non-linear in its way of explaining things to you as the audience. So I found that interesting. I never really sort of picked up on that sort of device that they used, but that seems to work. And again, the songs and the lyrics really do push the story forward.
Although I would say the songs in The Hobbit, I think, are vastly superior. Like the "Where there's a whip, there's a way" sequence.
Yeah.
While I found it like amusing as a teen, there's for a movie as short as this, it's amazing just how little of Return of the King, the novel, is actually in the movie. As I was watching it again a couple of days ago, I was like, they almost didn't even adapt more than 20 pages of the book. Like there's precious little Return, because they have like long songs and sequences that are total tangents that have nothing to do with the novel. And I love how 9 minutes into the movie, they just show the opening credits all over again. Like they do a second opening title sequence.
They show the title twice.
Yeah, I was like, you already did this.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I never realized that as a kid, but they do have a second title sequence or title card for the movie, and I'm like, what was the point of this? And maybe because it was for television, maybe there was a commercial break or something. I mean, there might have been a reason for it initially, but I also found it very interesting that they sort of go out of their way to ignore certain things that happened in the Bakshi film. They kind of didn't want that film to exist.
Yeah.
They kind of just wanted to pick up at a certain point in Tolkien's story, but not continue Bakshi's version of it. It was very obvious that they did that. I mean, not only is the animation vastly different, but they obviously bring Orson Bean back, and they, to voice both Frodo and Bilbo, which I thought was a really interesting choice. And obviously John Huston is back, and there's a lot of
Roddy McDowall. You got Casey Kasem in there as Mary,
yep.
which for me is
yep.
really weirdly distracting when you're watching it. Like having Casey Kasem doing like a dramatic performance.
Yeah,
it's really unusual. But if you're a fan of Mary Doc Brandybuck, then you'll enjoy Casey Kasem's interpretation of the character.
And he was a prolific voice artist in this time period. I mean, I immediately said, "Oh my God, that's Cliffjumper from Transformers." I mean, that's how I grew up first hearing his voice, and of course Scooby, Shaggy from Scooby Doo. I mean, there's just so many iconic animated characters that Casey Kasem voiced in the sort of 70s and 80s. But yeah, it's got a great voice cast. And
explain to me the DVD box cover though, because this one, it was a VHS box cover art, it was a DVD box cover art. It has like almost nothing to do with what actually happens in the story. You got two dwarves there from The Hobbit. Dwarves aren't even in this movie at all. Like Gimli doesn't show up.
Yeah.
Like there's no Gimli, no Legolas, none of that. So why you even have dwarves on the cover is a mystery. And then you have these two hobbits riding a horse with like a glowing sword, neither of which look like Sam or Frodo. Like Sam and Frodo are the stars of this movie. It's like, why not put Sam and Frodo on your box cover? But it's just two random anonymous hobbits that look nothing like the characters in the movie.
Yeah, and you're referring to the new remastered box art?
Yeah, well, it's the same box. It's the same box cover art that used to be around back when, like in the '90s, when it was released on VHS as well. Okay. And it's just it's an absolutely atrocious image.
Yeah, it's very strange. Yeah, this is an interesting one because I looked online, hoping that like The Hobbit, that maybe iTunes would have it in HD. It did not. I didn't even have it at all. And
no, I had to watch it illegally to even find it.
Yeah, so I ended up going online and looking for, again, no Blu-ray available. All there is right now is a standard definition but remastered DVD. Now it's very unlikely, even though it was made for television, it's very unlikely that they didn't finish it in high definition because it was shot on cells and everything. But I was really bummed that there wasn't a way to watch it in HD, because to me, right in this day and age on our new TVs, watching standard definition content on a 4K television
looks gross.
Really starts to look pretty crappy. So, but it was okay. It was actually a pretty good, because it was remastered. It looked pretty decent, and it was again great to see it uncut, without commercials, and in its entirety. Yeah, and the one thing that I always found funny is that the film is The Return of the King, Aragorn, and he's virtually not in the movie.
He has like 3 lines, and he's
the titular character, is actually in maybe the last 15 minutes or so, I think.
Yeah, Gandalf refers to him, and you see images of him, but yeah, he's basically not even a character in the story. Yeah, the whole idea of just the fellowship. This is a movie about the hobbits. Like Pippin and Merry get a lot of screen time. Sam and Frodo get a ton of screen time. But yeah, like I said, no Legolas, no Gimli, no Faramir. You get some Denethor in there. You get a little Theoden. You get Éowyn. Like the stuff with Éowyn, I feel like is brief but done pretty well. I love seeing Éowyn take out the Lord of the Nazgul. That's a pretty cool scene. Like this is a movie where it's a bad movie with a lot of fucking amazing scenes. And one thing I do like how it handles is what happens when somebody holds the ring with the intention of being imbued with its power to take someone on. Like there's a scene where but basically Sam is trying to find Frodo after he's been taken captive, and he bumps into an orc on the stairs, and Samwise grabs the ring, and it fills him with this sense of menace and power. And that's one thing that's cool from the books, is that the closer they got to Mount Doom, the more powers that the ring seemed to have. Like obviously in The Hobbit, you put on the ring, you turn invisible because you're kind of entering the Wraith world. But I like how you get to see how if somebody wished to wield the ring and challenge Sauron and try to become a new Lord of Middle-earth or whatever, you see a little bit of that at play, and I think that was handled pretty effectively. And I like seeing how evil Frodo gets toward the end when he finally does get taken over by the ring and puts it on and decides that he's not going to fulfill the quest. And so, yeah. And when Gollum bites his finger off and gets so excited that he basically trips and falls into the lava.
Yeah.
I cackle wildly each and every single time. So great little scenes, great little bits. But it's a very disjointed kind of broken movie. And it also has a lot of like weird little mistakes. Like so much of the movie is just about the fact that they don't have food and they don't have water, but they got to cross, what's it called? Like Gorgoroth. They got to cross over this horrible desert wasteland to get to Mount Doom. But at one point, Frodo's kind of thrashing about on the ground and Samwise is trying to console him. And I never noticed this until a couple of days ago. Frodo kicks over the water as he's doing it. I was like, whoa.
Yes, I know. He's like, you just wasted all of the water that you were just telling us was so precious.
Yeah.
And
like you're thrashing about talking about how thirsty you are. So yeah, maybe try not to kick over your water.
Yeah. Try to cherish the little water that you have. Yeah. And what you were saying before was interesting though, about when Samwise kind of wields the ring, the orcs are actually scared of him as a result. That's something that was never obviously, they never chose to visualize that in the
live action.
The live action versions. They, again, like you said, if they wore it, they were invisible, they could sneak around. But just by holding the ring, somehow in this film at least, they were implying that it made you look fierce and
it like imbues you with like God, like near God-like power or menace. You're something more than human when you've got the ring.
Right, when it's just in your presence or in your grasp. But I don't think it's a bad film. I just think that it suffers from being an incomplete film. Like if they had been able to do the entire trilogy in this style, I think it could be a very effective, good. I
would love that. If they had been able to do The Hobbit, Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and Return of the King as one continuous story, it would have been so goddamn cool. I think a lot of the problems stem from the fact that they're trying to make it a self-contained story, and Return of the King is not a self-contained story. It's the end of a really big, vast, complicated narrative. And it's funny, speaking of college experiences with these movies, I tried and had a disastrous experience showing this to people who were not Tolkien buffs nor the animation buffs, but I basically lied and told them all that it was amazing because I was such a fan from high school. And I popped this sucker in, and I had a few walkouts on this one. People were like, this sucks. And they walked out. But they were 19, 20-year-old boys who were not in the mood to watch The Return of the King.
Well, one other thought about this movie, I found it fascinating that they made a choice to sort of start the film with the question of, what happened to Frodo's finger, his missing finger. And it's sort of like you're building up to how he lost the finger. That was kind of the big mystery that the movie, or question that the film asks the audience and the other characters in the room at the beginning of the movie as he tells the story. It's how he lost his finger during this quest. And I thought that was kind of an interesting little thing. They really fixated on the losing of the finger and how that occurred. And obviously, today everyone knows from the live action films that it was bitten off. Well, I mean, it was bitten off here too, but you see it more graphically in the live action films. I believe it was done while he was invisible.
Yep. He and Gollum are fighting and wrestling. Sam's looking for him, and he finds Gollum fighting an invisible Frodo, and Gollum gets his teeth on his hand and bites the finger off.
Perhaps because it was a TV movie, they didn't want to show that.
Yeah,
that
scare the small children.
Yeah. But they sure showed his little nub a few times.
Absolutely. Well, it's one of those things where I feel like if you're a fan of the novel Return of the King, this movie, like I said, it adapts about 20 pages of text and leaves out a lot. So it can be kind of an unsatisfying experience. But the next movie on our list, I've never read the novel, but I saw this fucker in the theater. But of course, I'm talking about 1982, The Last Unicorn. And this is a movie that I think still plays pretty damn well. And it takes that kind of hippie, kind of folky music from The Hobbit and dials it up to 11 with a score by America that is pretty goddamn memorable. And you've got Mia Farrow and Jeff Bridges and Christopher Lee. Like, the voice talents that they lined up for this, it's like the perfect kids movie. I saw it when I was 6 years old in the theater. My grandmother took me and my siblings to see it, and we just fell under its spell. And I remember maybe when my brothers and sister were like 4, I showed it to them, and they absolutely loved it. And then I revisited it again recently. This movie, it plays. Like, some of the parts are obviously geared toward a very young sensibility, but I think it's actually a pretty amazing animated movie from this period.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it is definitely it's at its heart a kids movie, but yet, just like other films we've discussed during this period in time, it has some fairly adult things included. I mean, there's what I call the boob tree, where
The
the
boob tree
breasts.
is insane, and it scared
I
me
mean,
when I was 6.
for a
It
kids
it really
movie,
it really frightened me, and I remember I was so
yeah,
young. I got the boob tree from this movie and the Tree of Woe from Conan the Barbarian kind of
yes,
mixed up in my mind because I saw Conan when I was 5 and I saw this when I was 6, and I could never quite remember which movie had which tree, and so I just knew that being hung up on a tree in a fantasy movie was a bad thing. But yeah, the big
right,
boob tree is so sexual and so disturbing.
yes, for a children's movie. And then you also have the harpy creature with very visible nipples out on display and breasts. I mean, again, in a children's film.
Absolutely.
So just like when we discussed Star Chaser, and this is a time when
This is a rated G movie with tits.
I know, and I didn't know this. I just was doing some research, but apparently the version that I and we most of us have probably seen recently, the 25th anniversary release, which is on all the the VOD platforms and on video and Blu-ray, they actually edited out several uses of the word "damn." And
Interesting.
I was so angry that they did this, because why would you do this after 25 years? If anything, they should restore it back to its original form, because the people watching this movie in this day and age deserve to see the original theatrical version.
Yeah, PG and G
Yeah,
in the late 70s, early 80s were so much more hardcore than PG and G today. And it just, yeah, I mean, Kevin Marr from Kevin Geeks Out did a great video of all like the crazy, disturbing moments from PG movies from the late 70s and early 80s. And I think people forget
yeah,
just like those ratings are designed to reflect the standards and tastes of the time, not like a uniform standard by which you judge movies. And it is interesting how what's considered safe and conservative and child friendly in one era can be quite shocking in another. And yeah, I just not a day goes by where I don't thank my lucky stars I was born in 1976 instead of 1996.
but yeah, and both Molly and Prince Lear apparently had lines that included the word "damn" that were altered in some way for the subsequent releases, and that just bothers me. But anyway, yeah, it's I think I agree with you. It's probably their most theatrical kind of big. I mean, it is in many ways. It's the only one that of these 4 films, it's the only one that scored an actual fairly wide theatrical
Yeah, I
release.
mean,
It was
I
actually,
caught it in the theater in Richmond, Virginia,
yeah,
and so if it came to Richmond, it obviously got a pretty wide release.
and it was truly composed for widescreen cinemas, which you can definitely tell, and it works that way so much better. It's a more epic feel in many respects because of that. But yeah, watching it again late at night, I think you use the word sort of what did you say? It kind of hypnotizes you, or it kind of it just sort of takes you on this sort of strange hypnotic journey that is very interesting. I don't.
It's a very
think they,
haunting, melancholy
yeah,
movie for children. And something on Mia Farrow's voice, I remember when I was watching Rosemary's Baby in college, and I was like, why does this voice sound so familiar? Why does it sound so familiar? I was like, oh my God, that's the goddamn last unicorn. But
yeah.
she's kind of got the perfect voice for the character. Alan Arkin's so good. You got the actor
Oh
who
yeah.
played Gollum, he's back. It's a very creepy, eerie, strange movie. And it seems like it's a world where like nobody lives in it. Like they finally go to this
Right.
kingdom, and it's a kingdom that is ruled by and populated by like 2 people. You got the king and his son, and like that's it. That's a kingdom. And like this giant
Yeah.
castle, no towns, no armies, no anything. It's just a very strange fairy tale world populated by mythical creatures and the occasional like witch or bandit. But yeah, it's such a specific world that doesn't feel like any other. It's hard to do medieval fantasy and not feel derivative from Tolkien or not feel
Right.
derivative from like Robert E. Howard or Michael Moorcock, like some of these very famous sources of medieval fantasy material. The Last Unicorn definitely feels like its own thing.
I agree, and in doing some research, well, actually, the new sort of extra features that are on the Blu-ray show there's some really great stuff, that behind the scenes footage, some interviews, and they show some footage of the original author writer going on tour with the film over the last few years. and this film actually apparently has had the biggest worldwide sort of tour of any film in history, with the author kind of just traveling with the movie. It's got a huge cult following. One thing that's interesting is the voices. You mentioned a few of them. Alan Arkin is great as Schmendrick, but
such a great name, Schmendrick.
And a bunch of actors who were very close to landing the role were Dustin Hoffman, Harrison Ford, and Mark Hamill.
Whoa!
And isn't that interesting? Can you imagine how different it might have been? But Alan Arkin has a very distinct voice, but a very deep voice, and it's kind of an odd choice in a way for this kind of squirmy little magician.
But he has that great self-effacing humor, and Alan Arkin, he's such a marvelous actor. But this was definitely my first exposure to Alan Arkin, and he knocked it out of the park.
Oh yeah, and then Jeff Bridges apparently. I don't know if he was just a fan of the book or of Rankin and Bass, but he apparently, Jules Bass revealed in 2010 that Jeff Bridges called him out of the blue and just volunteered to do the film for free. He so wanted to be in the movie when he heard about it. And then he recommended his friend Jimmy Webb for the soundtrack. So, I love hearing those types of stories, because that just shows that these actors actually want to work on these interesting different projects.
Absolutely.
That are a little different than what they might normally do. And they really don't care. He probably had to get paid. I've learned this the hard way with SAG, but in the end, most of these actors would do things like this for free, because it's just they want to work. They want to do things in between projects, and voicing a interesting character in an animated film is such an easy gig that you can sort of squeeze in for maybe a week's worth of work at the most.
It's a pretty interesting love affair between his character and Mia Farrow. I mean, first and foremost, when the unicorn is turned into a lady, spoiler alert, she's fucking naked. I was like, all right, that's pretty hardcore for a G-rated movie. But they have a really interesting love affair where she basically almost forgets that she was a unicorn and doesn't want to go back to being one. Like, it's a weird, like Little Mermaid. She gives up her voice in order to have legs so that she can pursue the prince or the sailor or whatever the hell he is. But it's a weird thing where it's never like she forgets that she's a mermaid or forgets where she comes from. And of course, at the end, she gets the best of both worlds, where she gets to have her voice back and her legs and stay on land, blah, 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 blah. And it all ends very happily. But this is a weird thing where you see this internal struggle in her soul. And even Christopher Lee at one point, he kind of calls her out and looks into her eyes and gets confused when he's able to see his reflection. Because the first time he looks into her eyes, he sees like animals and that sort of thing. She's still very much a mythical creature, but she's being drained of her essence. But man, I get chills at the very end when she gets turned back into a unicorn and takes on the Red Bull. It's just such a fascinating idea. Like, you have this king who's rounding up all the unicorns from around the world and driving them into the sea so that he can feel good watching them basically squirm and writhe in torment forever in agony in his little oceanfront property. It's like, why don't they just go like 100 feet at the beach and haul ass? But that Red Bull,
and it's sort of a strange idea too, because it's almost like you can't see them unless you know they're there. It's like they're not really visible. It's like they've sort of become one with the ocean in some weird way. Like their energy is just in the ocean but needs to be freed. Like they're not. It's a very sort of surreal film in a lot of respects. One other, for Star Trek fans, Star Trek Deep Space Nine fans, the talking skull is played by Rene Auberjonois, who played Odo on Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Cool.
So
yeah, he's good. He's real good. Unicorn.
Yeah, it's sort of a rare sort of comedic character in the midst of a very serious film. I mean, it's a very dark and sad film.
Like even like the I guess the only other comedic role is the little cat who thinks he's a pirate. Like he's a cat, but he talks and dresses like he's a pirate. And it's like arr arr. Like it's such a strange, unusual little character, but it works in the context of the movie. And who's the actress who plays Tammy Grimes as Molly Grew? She's really good as well.
Yeah, and Angela Lansbury voices Mommy Fortuna. Of course, she returns to animation and Beauty and the Beast as Mrs. Potts. I mean, they did assemble a really great who's who of voice actors for the early 80s. It was a really great voice cast, and
also people forget
really
that in the 80s Disney was not the powerhouse it is now.
No.
Like between like before Little Mermaid, which I think came out in '88, Disney was kind of struggling to figure out what they were all about. And so in the absence of Disney being a powerhouse, you got the opportunity for things like this to emerge, or for Don Bluth and his movies to emerge. So I just like the fact that in the absence of Disney, a lot of these filmmakers stepped up to fill the void. But the gross in the USA was only 6.4 million, so it was not a runaway success, unfortunately. No. But I think it has totally withstood the test of time.
Oh yeah, and as I said, this little behind the scenes featurette that you can see both on the Blu-ray and the like the iTunes extras, if you want to get it from iTunes, it does this great job of showing how it almost has sort of like a Star Trek fan base, in the sense that these fans are diehard fans. They dress up as characters. They come to these screenings. Like, it really has become sort of like maybe Rocky Horror Picture Show. You know, it's when there are these midnight showings all over the world, people come out of the woodwork. Almost every time they've had one, they have to add a second showing because there are just too many people. So it's just one of those films that I think people like watching with an audience.
Yeah.
On a big screen, and sharing the experience or the memory of their first experience
with another generation. Absolutely.
With another generation of people that may have not seen it yet. So it definitely has become a cult classic in that respect. Probably in many ways more so than the Tolkien films. I think it has been, those are, people have seen them, but I think this has more kind of passion attached to it from the fan base. So it's a good film, and definitely worth checking out if you haven't seen
it. Good at 6, good at 40. It's just a good movie. It works.
Yep. And again, as you mentioned earlier, the animation was done by the Japanese studio Topcraft, which then went on to it. They worked on the next Rankin Bass film, which we'll talk about next, which is Flight of Dragons. But then they went on to do Nazca and the Valley of the Wind in 1984. Yeah, and I actually can sort of see it when the unicorn turns into Amalthea. Her eyes are very anime. It's the only character's eyes that sort of look like
a Japanese character.
What Japanese animation is, and it definitely kind of those little Japanese animation techniques seemed kind of. I think Rankin Bass directed them to create a very unique style, but there are moments that come through where the traditional, as Bill says, everyone that likes anime, like, they draw the same, and that is a problem. Their Japanese animation tends to all look very similar, whereas American animation and French animation, there's vast differences in the styles.
Although with some of the big CG animated movies that come out, basically from like Toy Story onward, you can make a similar criticism of a lot of the big studio animation of the last 20 years as well. So yeah, people definitely get safe and cautious when there's a lot of money on the line.
Yeah, I was referring more to traditional hand-drawn animation, not CG. But yeah, I agree with you. When it comes to the CG animation, it has there are sort of two boats. It's either the very photorealistic style that some of the Pixar films have chosen to do, or it's the kind of really absurd, cartoony, almost like trying to mimic the Warner Brothers style, where everything kind of distorts in weird ways. And I obviously there are people. Everyone has their own preference of animation style, but I'm still a huge fan of traditional hand-drawn animation and stop motion. I just think that there's more of the artistry of the people making it sort of comes through.
You can see the personality of the filmmakers. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the last one on our list, Flight of Dragons from 1982, which I had never seen ever until preparing for this episode, which was kind of a weird experience because I can't separate these other three from my childhood. This one, obviously, I can because it wasn't a part of my childhood. I wasn't even aware this movie existed until I remember in college. I think I bought like Secret of Nim or some movie on VHS, and it came with like a little like packet in it, and it had a bunch of other animated movies that were being sold by this VHS label or whatever. And I was like, Flight of Dragons, what the fuck is that? And I remember the poster was so lame. I was like, that looks, and it's the same image that you have on IMDb. I was like, that looks like something for like a little 3-year-old. But when did you first see Flight of Dragons?
So I actually never heard of it either, and never knew about it up until a couple months ago, because I I subscribe to a podcast that's put on by the Warner Archive Collection. It's like an offshoot of Warner Brothers Home Entertainment that produces and releases like very limited edition DVDs and Blu-rays of films that are very much not big enough for a wide release, or they do a million copy pressing. So they kind of do either on-demand pressings for customers of movies that are more obscure, or they do a small release of a film. And they decided to restore this film and into high definition for the first time and put it out on Blu-ray as part of the Warner Archive collection. So when I saw that and read and heard about that, I was like, an animated movie from the early 80s that I haven't seen or heard about?
One that has like John Ritter and Harry Morgan and James Earl Jones. I mean, it's got some major actors in it.
Exactly. So I was like, I pre-ordered a copy of it from Warner Archive, and that's the only way right now you can currently see it in HD. Every VOD platform has an old SD TV version. So if you want to see it restored, widescreen, HD, you do unfortunately right now have to.
Although it's saying here on IMDb that the aspect ratio is 1.33 to 1. Do you think that's a mistake, or do you think they put it in widescreen for the new release?
So they did, and so they claim in the release notes that it's presented in its original theatrical aspect ratio that it was intended to be seen in when it was supposed to be released theatrically. But when I watched this, it looked, again, like you were talking about with The Hobbit, it looked like they were cropping the tops off. And it could have been done as that open matte way that I mentioned earlier, but it still felt like they were cutting off too much information. So I have a feeling that it wasn't, they were hoping for a theatrical release, but at some point they realized they weren't going to get that. And the 4:3 ratio was sort of the fallback, for television and video. So that's how they finished the film.
Well, it's unfortunate because this movie is kind of relatively unknown. Maybe give people an idea of what the premise is, because it comes from Peter Dickinson's book, and Peter Dickinson is a character in the movie.
He's the main character.
So give people the premise of this sucker.
It's basically about this young kind of Boston writer / board game developer who is obsessed with wizards and dragons and everything, and he gets taken back in time to an era when these things existed. And the main theme, I think, really of the film is sort of this, the differences between science, technology, and magic, and sort of or logic and magic. It's sort of the contrasting nature of those two ideas. And the time that this Peter Dickinson character gets brought back to is one of magic. But magic is starting to die in this world. It's starting to become lost because more and more tools are being developed and technologies are being developed by humans to help them do things, and magic is no longer needed. So it's kind of imagining a world where way back in it, there was magic, there were dragons, but as humans evolved and became more technological, that part of us sort of died out. And so there are apparently 4 wizards that each command different aspects of the world, and they devise a plan. They're brothers, I believe, and they devise a plan to basically create a hidden valley where magic will survive forever. That they see the writing on the wall, they see that magic is dying, that science is going to take over. So they want to create this kind of hidden dome where magic and fairies and dragons can stay and live forever. Kind of like what they did to the Native Americans, like round them up, put them in a reserve, and just kind of let them live their life out there. But of course, there's one evil character voiced by James Earl Jones. He's the one of the 4 brothers named Omadon, and he has another plan. He believes that he essentially wants to allow humans to take over with technology.
He plays this wizard and Thulsa Doom in the same year.
That's true. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. This character comes back in time to essentially go on another quest to stop Omadon, to stop his evil plan. to sort of bring about the end of magic and to let humans basically go on to kill each other through weapons of war in the future. And there's kind of a weird section where you see like flash forwards to like World War II, and yeah, it's a little trippy. It's a little out there, you know.
It's once again, it's got great scenes that I like. Another thing I kind of enjoyed. If you're a fan of Rankin Bass movies, you'll see little characters or designs that seem familiar from some previous movies of theirs. Like at one point, they stop in a pub, and there are 5 people who look identical to the Witch King of Angmar and Return of the King. It's like, oh, that's 5 Lords of the Nazgul, like same armor, same sword, same everything. And a lot of the dragons obviously would look like Smaug from The Hobbit and that sort of thing. So you definitely get to see more of what you love. But I would say maybe, perhaps just because I'm seeing it at such a different age, it doesn't necessarily have the same thrust in terms of the story that The Last Unicorn has. I think The Last Unicorn comes together as a movie a lot more. But it is, if you're a fan of D&D, everyone loves to see lineups when you have like, you know, your elven archer and like your cleric and your wizard and your knight and like all these different like kind of archetypes kind of joining forces. And you do see a little bit of that in here, where by the end they have a little band of adventurers, each with their own special skill set and that sort of thing. I think her name is Danielle. She's the beautiful archer with red hair.
Yeah.
And she is voiced by boom 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 boom. Where is she? Oh, voiced by Nellie Bellflower. So that definitely tickled my D&D itch a little bit. But I did have a little bit of trouble just getting into it as a movie overall. I feel like if I'd seen it when I was like 6 or 7, I would have a very different feeling about it. But seeing it now, it's hard to get completely emotionally invested in.
Yeah, I was the same way. I was reading a bunch of like online, you know, comments and reviews on Amazon and other sites, and the people that grew up watching this on TV, on video, it's like what we're talking about with The Hobbit. They just love it. They think it's the greatest movie in the world. But again, I think that has a lot to do with how you see something when you're younger. It plays a huge role in how you look at it when you're older, because sometimes it's very hard to differentiate. You see it through your childhood eyes, and you just can never see it any other way. So I think for somebody, yes, coming to this for the very first time, it's not going to have the same impact than if you actually watched it growing up. But it's kind of, I'm sad that it never did get a theatrical release. It was delayed and delayed. It finally apparently got released on television in 1985, and of course onto VHS later on. But it was produced in 1982, the same year as The Last Unicorn. So they obviously were sitting on this film for quite some time before they found a way to release it. But once it did come out, it garnered, just like all their other projects, it garnered a great cult following with younger viewers, and it certainly became one of the last major Rankin Bass projects, because, as you said, I think they shuttered their production company in '87. So if this came out '85 on television, '86 on VHS, it might be
animation,
one of the final.
It's a tough racket. I mean, you see just time and time again how just, if you're not Disney and you're not one of the major studios that has the ability to withstand a ginormous financial failure, it's very hard to survive. But you see that with someone like Jules Bass. I mean, as late as 2012, he was still doing like consulting, producing work on like the revival of the Thundercats TV series and things like that. So they kept in business and they kept working, but they never reclaimed those heights. Because if you look at Bass, he was an executive producer from 85 to 89 on the original Thundercats. And then it wasn't until 2011 that he did another thing, Butterfly Blues. Maybe he just, after Thundercats, kind of got demoralized or figured, my time in the sun is drawing to a close.
It's interesting too, because this is around the same time that Ralph Bakshi also sort of
took a hiatus.
And he tried one last time with Cool World, I think in '91, to kind of have his big comeback film, but that didn't work. And then after that, aside from I think a short-lived HBO series in the late '90s called like what was it called, Spicy City, I think. He really didn't do much of anything that was widely seen until he did his Last Days of Coney Island Kickstarter project a couple years ago, which I am an executive producer on. But yeah, it was a weird time. I feel like this sort of mid to late 80s where a lot of these greats from the 60s and 70s were starting to sort of die out. And it's around the same time, as you mentioned before, that Disney sort of
exploded. Yeah, they reclaimed their territory. Yeah.
Yeah, and every year for the next like 6 or 7 years, they had, the biggest, most successful animated film.
Like they did with like fucking Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and The Lion King. It was just like boom, boom, boom every year. It's like holy shit, just these runaway success stories.
Yeah, I mean, and culminating really, I think the height of their success really would be with the animated Beauty and the Beast, because it was the only animated movie ever to be nominated for Best Picture. And
but wasn't Spirited Away nominated for Best Picture in 2001 or 2 when it came out?
I don't think so. I will have to double check on that, but that's why one reason I'm sad that they actually. I'm happy that they came up with a Best Animated Feature category, but I'm also sad because what that means is they're saying, "Oh, animated films can't be Best Pictures."
Yeah.
They're just animated films. And whereas Beauty and the Beast proved that it doesn't require this, the medium shouldn't matter.
I'm wrong. Spirited Away won Best Animated Feature Film in 2003, but it was not nominated for Best Feature Film. So
it was one of the first, right? One of the first Best Animated.
Yeah, after they invented the category. But it was,
exactly.
Yeah, one of the few non-Disney movies though to actually win.
Yeah, although I think it was released.
It was distributed by him, but it's obviously a Studio Ghibli movie. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But it's just it was so great, and I think it was '93 when Beauty and the Beast got nominated, because whether you liked the movie or not, it is widely considered one of the crown jewels of animation in terms of just the quality of the animation. But just the fact that it was up there with 4 other movies that were much more, serious and dramatic, it just said something about the Academy that year. They really that the materials used to create the film don't matter. That it's really what the story the film is telling, and the impact the film is having on the culture and society of that year. That's what matters.
And it's kind of the great heyday, or like the second great heyday of cel animation at Disney, because after Katzenberg and Eisner had their big falling out, and Katzenberg left very, very publicly, I feel like that's right around the same time that John Lasseter and the Toy Story crew came in 1995. And if you look from 1995 forward, every big Disney animated movie was now part of this new Pixar craze. It seems like from Little Mermaid through Lion King, that was like their second traditional cel animation renaissance. They made a lot of traditional cel animated movies after Katzenberg left, but I don't think any of them creatively reclaimed those heights during that brief period.
Yeah. There was a couple more that still, like I think it was Pocahontas maybe in '94.
That was a big one. Tarzan was a big one. Like Hunchback of Notre Dame was a big one.
Right.
And Hercules was a big one. I thought Hercules fucking sucked balls. But
it was, that was an example where the animation to me was too cartoony, too, again, like Warner Brothers-esque in terms of it was very flat, and everything kind of moved. I mean, it's a style. Again, people can like whatever style they like, but it was definitely a departure for for the sort of photorealistic. I don't mean photo, but sort of like the
more grounded. I was so excited for Hercules. I went to the El Capitan Theater in LA. I was either my first or second summer out there as an intern, and I was like, "This is Disney. This is Greek mythology. It's gonna rule." And I remember like 5 minutes into it, I was like, something's going wrong. I had the same experience with Batman and Robin. Like Batman and Robin and Hercules, they might have come out in the same summer, but both of them they wounded me in my soul.
Yeah, I remember that was like '97. I think that was a bad year there weren't that many good summer movies that year. But animation has its ups and downs. But like you said, I think you're right. There are these sort of these ups and downs, these peaks and valleys in terms of where the industry goes. So you had this wave of non-Disney films throughout the early to mid 80s and there were some very big ones like An American Tail and The Land Before Time.
Huge.
But which Spielberg and Lucas produced those and were involved in the writing.
All
and
Dogs
then
Go to Heaven, things like that. But yeah,
yeah,
there were definitely some non-Disney animated movies that broke out.
that's right. And like you said, but then once '95 rolled around and Toy Story came
Changed
out,
the business.
all of a sudden
Yeah.
it changed. It changed once again. That reign of hand-drawn animation by Disney from '88 to sort of '95 had sort of had effectively come to an end. They didn't stop, but the big hits year after year after that.
Going back to what I was discussing earlier about how people in college are always looking for the great movies to watch while on shrooms. Toy Story was the undisputed heavyweight champion. And remember, I had the VHS of Toy Story, and not a week or month would go by where I didn't have a bunch of like frat guys showing my door like, "We need to borrow your copy of Toy Story." I'm like, "Fine, take it." And they'd go off and they'd trip balls and watch Toy Story. And these were frat guys, but they just knew they were gonna have the time of their lives, and they'd bring it back to me. But that VHS got a lot of use.
It's funny because I would obviously think of Heavy Metal or other films of that period being, or even The Hobbit. That's what I envision. But Toy Story, yeah, I'm not sure I see the connection. But
it's just because
we need to look at something.
It was so new and so fresh
Yeah.
and so different. I think a lot of times people forget. Like I bash on some of these computer generated animated movies from time to time. But when Toy Story came out, it was like, whoa, this is something quite new, and it really knocked everybody's socks off.
Yeah, it without a doubt, it was groundbreaking, and there wasn't anything like it. That was, I think, the big thing was that it was one of those benchmarks in cinema history where we really were seeing something we hadn't seen before. And it's sort of like when they first made the T-Rex CG, there was a live action T-Rex and a CG one, and you couldn't tell the difference.
Yep.
Like people were just like, this is a game changer. It's like, this is, unfortunately though, those game-changing films they still hold up. But if you look at other movies in the 90s that did use CG, they look horrible. Like the really good ones are great, like T2 and Jurassic Park. But then
Starship Troopers, I feel like Starship Troopers, a lot of people overlook how real those fucking monsters look. And that movie's 21 years old now.
I know. But then you look at it was on TV recently. I saw the end of that Harrison Ford one.
Air Force One, when the plane crashes. Dude, don't even talk about it. It's maybe the worst special effect in that entire decade.
Oh, it's horrible. But there are so many bad CG effects in the 90s, and I feel like they saw what could be done, and the studio executives or the bean counters were like, "Oh, we can do it cheaper by just doing CG, so let's just do it that way instead of doing a great model, crashing or whatever," which was more expensive.
Anything other than what they settled on. Like Wolfgang Peterson, I imagine, must have wanted to kill himself when he finally saw. Like that's in our movie. That's what we have to live with. Like, let's spend $100 and we can probably do it better.
It like ruins the movie.
Yeah.
Anyway. Visual effects are a whole nother topic.
Absolutely. Well, Adam, I can't thank you enough for pitching this topic. I think it was a cool one. I like how we keep exploring these kind of overlooked, forgotten little chapters in animation history, and let's definitely continue to do so. But in the near future, anything you want to plug or anything? Like this episode might not go up for like 5 or 6 days, so we can't really plug like Bill's screening, which is tomorrow night. But
right.
You want to plug any social media or anything like that?
There's a short film that I executive produced called Super Sex, which is going to be playing its final film festival, the Cleveland International Film Festival, beginning Thursday, April 5th. And it actually has 5 screenings through April 5th and April 15th. So if you live in Ohio and you want to check out a really funny short comedy that's directed by Matthew Modine, stars Ed Asner, Kevin Nealon, Elizabeth Perkins, Efren Ramirez, and Matthew's daughter, Ruby Modine. This will be probably the last chance to see it projected on a big screen. And shortly after this, we will probably be releasing it on iTunes, similar to James and I have a short that we produced with Bill Plimpton called Cop Dog, and we're also working to get that film up and available on iTunes in the near
basically
future.
We've signed the deal, and now we're just waiting for the date that is going to come out.
Exactly. Sometimes there are windows to which you have to wait for content to get released through iTunes. So even though it's in the pipeline, it doesn't go live right
We're in
away.
hurry up and wait mode.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got that screening, and then yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter at Adam Rackoff, AdamRackoff, and I'm always happy to continue these conversations on Twitter or offline.
And
So
to
if
come
you
up
have,
with catchy catchphrases in order
Yes,
to help people
exactly.
promote their podcasts.
I have to think about what were some. I have to look back at that conversation.
There's no
I
way.
honestly
It
can't.
was so long ago. You'd have to scroll through just thousands of exchanges to find that one little part.
There were quite a few though, and I just can't recall what some of them were. They were kind of just, it was one of those spur of the moment things. They were just kind of popping out. But yeah, we'll have to come up with some alternative.
Yeah, at a certain
Uh,
point, people will get tired of hearing me say it, and I'll forget to say it, and we'll have to come up with a replacement. But it definitely works
well,
for now.
yeah, and I get a penny every time you say it.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so thanks again for having me on, and it's always fun. We seem to be, as of lately, talking about animation, whether it's Star Chaser or Bill Plimpton or Rankin Bass. So it's kind of a fun way to explore the medium that you and I are producing in.
I think it's a way of
And
putting our money where our mouth is. If we're going to always talk
yeah,
about how animation should be about more than just your big pop culture mainstream kind of success stories, well then we need
right,
to shine a light on the movies that are the statistical outliers. And I feel like
exactly.
Last Unicorn is a great example of an animated movie that has withstood the test of time. It's incredibly beautiful stuff and has incredibly moving scenes, and it ain't part of the mainstream. It's something totally different, but it's become an animated classic, and I like shining a light on some of these forgotten gems.
I agree. Yeah, and you know, something we could also consider or perhaps do down the road is look back to some of the history and beginnings of animation as well.
Dude,
And
Tex Avery
yeah,
and like who like the Fleischer
the Fleisch
brothers
brothers. Yeah,
and like Bob Clampett and like some of those old maniacs from way back when, like Chuck Jones. Like there are a lot of
yep,
pioneers that have been totally woefully neglected. So we might have,
yeah,
but Tex Avery, his movies can be quite politically incorrect by 2018 standards. I remember even by the
yes,
90s when at the UVA Clemens Library had this giant Laserdisc box set of every short he ever made. And even like in 1996, I was like, holy shit, these things are fucking racist.
yeah,
Sometimes it's hard to find Tex Avery movies because they definitely are of their time, but the
yeah.
animation is staggering. And so,
It is.
yeah, he's one of the original pioneers.
And it's really amazing sometimes to look back at some of the animation from the 20s and 30s and just to realize that they were inventing this stuff as they went along. There was no animation school. There was to teach you. They were figuring out how to tell stories with drawings and how to make the mouths move to speak. It's just fascinating to see.
Yeah, we
And then
definitely have some of those pioneers on our to-do list, without a doubt.
yeah. So anyway, there's over 100 years of animation to be discussed if we ever decide to get to it. So
We
the
could probably lure Bill back to talk about Winsor McKay. He loves Winsor
ah
McKay, and he's
yeah,
the pioneer.
yes, he is the first, really. He is the father in many respects of modern animation. I mean, there were people doing photography that kind of created, and there was like Muybridge, who was doing sequential photography to kind of make things look like they were moving. But in terms of art, drawn cartoons, if you will, yeah, Gertie the Dinosaur, Little Nemo, and Slumberland. These were some of the very first things out there.
Absolutely. And of
Definitely.
course, Flying House, which is how I met you, because you did the Kickstarter
Yes,
campaign
that's
for
true.
that short. And then when I first cold called Bill, when I met him for the first time, I said, hey, I was really impressed by the crowdfunding campaign you did for Flying House. Do you have any other projects cooking in the oven that I could be a part of? So it was through your work on Flying House that Bill and I became affiliated.
Yeah, and that was a good example of where we restored the film. The original black and white film was restored first, but then Bill kind of did his digital kind of interpretation of it, where he added color and new voices and cut out the title cards. He did a Lucas version of it, but he at least kept the original one intact, and not only kept it intact, but gave it a brand new HD restoration. So
Yeah, it wasn't like he was replacing the original. It was just a new interpretation of it, which I think is how you're going to do it, because otherwise the film preservationists are going to chop your fucking dick off. Like
Exactly. And the DVD has both versions on it. They're both pretty much available together. But I think his intentions were always good. He wanted to basically introduce younger people to who Winsor McCay was and sort of get them excited. So to do that, he thought having a sort of a shorter, more condensed, more tightly edited, and with color and voices and new music would sort of perhaps draw them in, kind of be the hook to get them in. And then from there, they might want to explore his other earlier works.
Well,
so,
at least y'all lured me in, so.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this sucker up. But thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please consider giving our podcast a subscribe. Leave us a review on iTunes. That is the best way you can possibly help the podcast if you are a regular listener. And coming up, we got Bill Scurry for Jamie Lee Curtis. Got Andy Webb. We're going to be talking about Marty Brest, which should be interesting because I actually worked on a Martin Brest movie in the accounting department. So some fun stuff on the horizon. I'm looking forward to recording for you guys. But yeah, as always, thank you so much for listening. Onwards and upwards.